short dance about architecture and action games. I'm one half of Spooky Squid Games. I do the game design and the art and a lot of other little things there, but I do not do the programming most of the time. I'm also part of the Hand-Eye Society that does a bunch of cool cultural events in Toronto. And as part of that, I started something called Comics vs. Games. It gets game developers and indie comic people doing stuff together, because that's awesome. So these are a bunch of the games that I've worked on in the last 5 years. But I'm not really going to talk about them. I'm mainly going to talk about stuff having to do with our first commercial game, which is They Bleed Pixels, which is a platforming beat 'em up with really sort of unique one-button combat and a really cool checkpoint system where you're a little girl with claws who beats the crap out of monsters. Next slide. So normally I would show a trailer here, but we don't have time because I've got a lot of slides. Go back, but do come and play it at the end of the night. I think I'm showing it. And the one thing I found with They Bleed Pixels, it's not only the hardest game we've made to beat, it's also the hardest game to talk about. And I've been thinking for a while about that. So why are performance platformers and action games in general just so hard to talk about? What is it that makes them so difficult to talk about? And I think partially it's vocabulary. We don't really have a lot of good words to talk about them, but I don't think that's all of it. I think there's something unique about games that is also shared with music and animation and dance, that it's very temporal, it's very physical. There's just elements that we're not good at talking about. Words just don't work well for that. Next slide. But that quote, which I really like when thinking about action games, you can sort of go deeper into it, because performance platformers really are dance and architecture combined in a really unique way. And what I mean by that is that the dance and that the player's moveset and movement physics are sort of the dance component, and then the levels are architecture. And each time a player plays through the game, they sort of perform an improvised dance within the constraints of the level and the physics and movement system. Which is all sort of a long way of saying that what I'm going to talk about is really hard to talk about. So this may go terribly, terribly long. We'll see how it goes, but let's do a short dance about action games. I may stumble a bit on some of the steps, but I think we'll make it through. So 1 year after They Bleed Pixels was made, it's now been 1 year and a month, I think, since we came out. I now sort of know what the most controversial game design decision we made with it was. And that is the one-button combat system. People either love it or they really, really hate it. So either we created a brilliant one-button combat system that is full of depth and beauty, or we should be shot on sight and never allowed to make a game again, depending on your views. Which brings up a question, and my answer for it. Can controls be not really the question, but is are controls an aesthetic property of games, the same way that, say, the music is, or I think we now recognize the game feel, the physics and such are aesthetic choices. And I think it's obvious that controls are an aesthetic choice when we look at motion control games and we look at a lot of other sort of innovative stuff that's happening. But I think they're also an aesthetic choice, an artistic choice when it comes down to the old-fashioned gamepad. So in They Bleed Pixels, we used something that I call overloaded controls. I don't know if there's a real word for this that people have come up with and use regularly. I can't find it. It's that vocabulary problem. But I define them as when pressing a single button or direction has a different effect based on a combination of how it is pressed, what other controls are also active, and the player character's state at that time. And I'm going to kind of unpack that with a few examples. So this is the most common overloaded control, which is the long press to do some sort of special attack. Best known probably for Link's circular blade attack. And this comes up a lot. But this is the one that I see the least of, as far as I know, which is double tapping on gamepads. Like, we do this all the time with mice, but for some reason it's not in a lot of gamepad action games. And I think there's a lot of space there to explore using that as a control scheme. There are reasons why it's not used as much as it could be, but I don't have time to go into them. And this is one that's really core to They Bleed Pixels, and also to some of my the other games that sort of inspired it. Nidhogg, which is amazing, and this is where you push in a direction and hit a button, and it does something different than if you're not pushing in that direction, or if you're pushing like in a different direction. And the ground pound, which is a good example of when the player's state, the fact that they're in the air or on the ground, makes a difference. So those are sort of a bunch of the examples of stuff that I do sort of count under that, that general overloaded control definition. This is something I don't count, which is the action button, where it does different things depending on what you're near, whether you're near an NPC, whether you're near a pot, whether you're near a door. And I don't count those because they're not really inherent to the player and the character. There's something outside of them. So I'm going to quickly describe a little bit of the philosophy I had behind the control system in They Bleed Pixels, and I hope you'll take the time to play it because this will make a lot more sense, I think, with that context. But basically, if you're pushing in a direction and you hit the attack button, you're going to do something that does damage. You're going to do some sort of slash, you're going to do some sort of stab. But if you're not moving in a direction and you hit the same button, you'll do a kick, which moves the enemy somewhere, up in the air or to the side. And to kick an enemy up in the air, which is going to be important in a second, you have to actually hold the button down for a while. So I feel the result of this control scheme, and of well-done overloaded control schemes, is you get this interesting situation where the game mechanics and the play balance of the game are in harmony with the physical constraints of the controller. And by physical constraints, I mean the fact that you can't be pushing in two different directions on a gamepad, which on a keyboard you actually can. It's kind of annoying. So here's an example in terms of how the controls enforce a rule that we wanted the game to have. Well, we wanted to make sure that the character could not run and kick at the same time. They had to stand still. And we could have done this by just interrupting the player's control. But I feel that that's a less sort of harmonious way of doing things. And instead, what we have is that you basically literally cannot input a control that is both movement and kick at the same time. So if we'd separated the buttons, it wouldn't have been quite as harmonious. So here's another example with kicks, and this is where the play balance is connected to the overloaded controls. So kicking enemies up is really, really useful in They Bleed Pixels. It generally incapacitates them. They can't do anything to you when they're in the air. But it also gets you high combos, which with the checkpoint system we have means you get checkpoints sooner, and it makes the game easier. So we needed a cost for that, which is that you actually have to hold the button down for a while to pull it off, and you can be attacked during that time. Again, we could have locked this out just using a long animation, but again, you're suddenly disconnecting what the player is doing with the controller from what is happening on screen and what they're sort of thinking about. So some other pros that I think you get out of this is it discourages button mashing and encourages thoughtful play. That was a really important design goal for They Bleed Pixels. We wanted a beat 'em up that was not random and just about button mashing. And the good thing about it is basically if you don't know what you're doing and you're just button mashing with a control like They Bleed Pixels, you create basically chaos. Like it doesn't look like you're thinking about what you're doing at all. You're dashing into things, you're dashing into spikes, you die. There's a pleasure to the high-level play in that there's a sort of rhythm that you get into once you're good at those types of controls, where the fact you're only hitting a few buttons and thinking about the direction at the same time as the button just feels good. And that's obviously an aesthetic thing. Some people may disagree. But there's definitely some downsides. A lot of players just aren't literate in this type of control. They're not used to it. They haven't played Smash Brothers. They haven't played any of the very few other games that use these sorts of controls. And so they're just confused. But I think that it's not alone with that. If you throw someone who's never played a third-person shooter or two with WASD controls or dual sticks, they'll also be really confused. And you can't actually teach it by just letting people experiment because they're unlikely to do the right combination of things, or they're less likely to. And so because of this, you need to actually have really detailed tutorials, which you'll see if you play the game we have. And these are things that are sort of maybe pros, maybe cons. It definitely privileges the experience of high-level play over early accessibility. So it's much more fun once you're good at the game than it is early on. And I'm okay with that. I think that that is a useful design goal. But it's often one that is not popular these days. And I think we're losing out on a whole bunch of interesting play space because we avoid that. There's lots of unexplored game design space, which is good but also scary because you can screw up in all sorts of ways and people will get angry at you on the internet. And finally, it is difficult to talk about. Thanks. That was a short dance.